So for those who are online, we are just sorry we just got a little bit late. So give us a couple of minutes and we'll start. I think we'll go ahead and get started just for the sake of people who are online. It's been a very unique day for our church. We just, all of us got back from a kind of a brief city council meeting. We're trying to kind of advocate for the church, so sorry we're running a little bit late. But today we're going to start a new series on Leviticus. And I got to thank Abuna Daniel because, like, you know, when he was like saying, okay, we're going to start Leviticus, and it's like, oh, you know, that's probably, he didn't say that word, but it was like one of the most boring, you know, books. Or like, you know, like put me up to challenge how to get Leviticus in there. So before going Leviticus, and this would be a shorter series for like 3 sessions, but before going Leviticus, a lot of people struggle with Leviticus because as they look at it and they look at the sacrificial system, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. But when you put Leviticus, actually, so surprisingly, when you look actually at the Jewish tradition, one of the most important books they ever taught was Leviticus. In fact, they said that Leviticus was the most important to learn. And for us, it's like one of those like we just bypass over. But you realize in Leviticus, the fundamental question in Leviticus is, who may abide in your tabernacle? It's about dwelling with God. And you start to realize, and this is where I'm going to try to actually separate Leviticus today a little bit, like, because actually when you study Leviticus, you study Leviticus as Exodus and Leviticus together, okay? Because they go hand in hand. And I'm going to try to separate it a little bit and put it in the big scheme of the whole biblical account. Because Leviticus is about the question, not necessarily who can just meet God, but who can dwell with God. And it's interesting, this Psalm 15, that question, so the Jewish pilgrims, when they would go every year to Jerusalem, okay, as they were going up Mount Jerusalem, Mount Zion, okay, there were some psalms that they would recite, just like we have our own psalms when we have our own liturgical prayers. One of the first questions that they would ask in each one of them is basically the question, when they're going up, Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle? Who may dwell in your holy hill? As they're going up. And this, where did they get this from? It's actually when we studied Exodus and the book of the Song of Moses, or the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15. The purpose why God brought them out of Egypt was not just to, you know, put the Egyptians to shame, was not just for them to be free, but was for them to freely be able to dwell and live and worship God. In the song they say, you'll bring them in and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, in the place, O Lord, which you have made for your own dwelling. I'm going to jump very, very quickly just for you to understand, because that's how Leviticus needs to be understood. It's answering this question. And as we reflect on it in the New Testament, you almost have to come to the very end of the New Testament. Okay, John, we read it every time in the night of Apocalypse, the Apocalypse. I saw the new city, New Jerusalem, coming down from heaven, prepared as a bride. And a voice said, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them. So if we're going to understand Leviticus in those 3 sessions, understand it in a story from Genesis to Revelation. That's the way to think about it. It's not just about picking a lamb, sacrificing, killing it, and then roasting it. It's not about that. It's about how does this fit in the whole scheme of the salvation. If you look at Leviticus, and actually next time we're going to go a little bit more in details actually in Leviticus, but Leviticus actually is the shortest book of the Pentateuch. However, saying that, Jewish scholars say it is the heart of the Pentateuch. First of all, it is the third book out of 5. And not just this, you will find something very interesting. Leviticus 16, which we're going to talk about next time, or the last one, which is the Day of Atonement, which is considered the day of being at one, atonement, at one with God, is the heart of Leviticus. So what is the heart of the Pentateuch? It's Leviticus. What is the heart of Leviticus? It is being at one with God. Okay? That's the whole purpose of it. Leviticus, as we're going to talk about today, and this is where I'm going to draw a little bit of those parallels. It is a return to Eden, not necessarily Eden, like the paradise lost. It's not this. It's actually a return to Eden as God's original plan for dwelling with his people. Okay? You'll find that actually the tabernacle and what it was given in Leviticus was trying to restore again that original calling of the paradise, that God was dwelling amongst his people. And then in New Jerusalem, that's the end of creation. Does anyone know, anyone pay attention, okay, to the last prayer? The last prayer the priest says at the end of every liturgy, okay? Does anyone, like he says, like when he's going around the altar, the very last, after the whole liturgy is done, okay? He says like there, walk among them, dwell among them, right? He says like, walk among them and dwell among them. So God, like Abuna is inviting God to this dwelling amongst his people every time we celebrate a liturgy. That's how important this is. So where do we know this parallel? So now, you know me by now. I love looking at parallels. I love looking at words. I love looking at the language. So how do we come up with this idea that the tabernacle in Leviticus is a restoration of Eden? Let's start to look at the parallels. First of all, just like the Spirit of God created the world in the beginning, the Spirit of God came, it's actually the same word, the Spirit of the Lord, the Ruach Elohim, came on Bezalel, who was the artisan, who designed and manufactured the tabernacle. So just like God, his Spirit manufactured the world, Bezalel, who was given the gift of the artisan, was moved by the Spirit. Not just this, it's very interesting. Look at this word. So going back to Genesis 1:14, when God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons." You'll find something very interesting. And if anyone remembers from the Genesis account, we actually talked about in the Genesis account, the sun and moon are never named, okay? Because when you name them, you make out of them almost like a god, okay? Because they were named as gods in the Canaanite society. It was called the greater light and the lesser light. But it's interesting, the word light, ma'or, okay, which was given at the time of Genesis creation, is the same word used for the menorah in the tabernacle, okay? So the same word, like as if God made the sun and the moon and the stars as this cosmic menorah, okay, to light the cosmos, the world, the same parallel is actually the menorah, the same light, the same word is used. Not just this, when we read for signs and seasons, okay, we think of actually our crops, our season crops, and our agriculture seasons. That actually word is not related to agriculture. It's related specifically to liturgical seasons. That word mo'adim is referred in Genesis 1 and is used only after that as related to the tabernacle. Only to the tabernacle. So as if God is saying that as he created the cosmos with light and seasons of worship, the parallel is the tabernacle with light and seasons worship. So it's a call to worship. Not just this, it's very interesting that in the building of the tabernacle, God gives 7 speeches as instructions for building the tabernacle. And we know in the creation of the world in Genesis 1, it was 7 days and 7 times he says, "Let there be XYZ." Okay, so you start to see this parallel of 7 words of creation and 7 instructions of building the tabernacle. The tabernacle is the new Eden where God can dwell with his people. Not just this, we talked about it, just refreshing your memory from, Adam. When Adam was given the command to tend and to keep, to guard and keep, those 2 words were used in that conjunction in a very only one other instance, which was the command given to the priests in the tabernacle. So Adam is depicted as the original high priest, given also similar to what the tabernacle had in there. Not just this, it's very interesting when it says that the Lord made to Adam and his wife tunics of skin and clothed them. Similar to when Moses brought Aaron and his sons and clothed them with tunics. The word for to clothe, labas, lips, okay, which is actually like very similar to the Arabic. And tunic, ketunaid, in Egypt, al-kitan, al-utn, okay, it's like you see the similar words, okay. Those words, what was given, how God gave this to Adam and Eve, also Moses gave to Aaron and his sons. You see the parallel? Where now this is actually now, like God has done the creation, he's got the priesthood, he has clothed them with white and glory in order to serve him. The menorah is very interesting because the menorah, when you look at actually the original description of menorah, it's not just a chandelier like this with like 7 candles on it. No, it had an artistic rendition of actually leaves and plants, okay, underneath it, as if this was the original tree of life. It was kind of almost like a stylized tree of life. So every time that the high priest would go in, he would bring in humanity again into Eden. Not necessarily just a nostalgia of what has been there, but actually a calling of the original Edenic condition of dwelling with God without fear and without any problem. The reality is that as we know, and this is actually where it becomes actually the similarity becomes very interesting, because how we're now trying to approach again Eden, how we're going to try to approach this dwelling. You find from Eden to the exile, this is so beautiful in the symbolism. There's a movement downwards. Eden was thought in the original cosmology that was built on a mount, okay, the Garden of Eden, the garden itself was on a mountain, okay, because that was the meeting place with God. And when Adam and Eve were exiled to the plains. But then even when they die and they go into exile, they go into Egypt. So it became like a 3-level. Eden is God's holy mountain. The exile is just the ordinary earth. And then Egypt, or Sheol, was the grave. So in the cosmology, you had this 3-level pattern. And this actually is going to be very, very interesting as we look at it. So the temple, which was God's dwelling all the way up, the middle earth, which is human habitation, and then the chaos, or the waters, or Sheol, was death. So that's one of the reasons why you start to see this pattern, okay, being reversed in all the stories of redemption. Okay, look at the story of Noah. He comes from the flood waters all the way to be delivered up where? On Mount Ararat. And then he comes down from the mount to the earth to live his life. Okay, you find Israel through the Red Sea. Okay, they get delivered from Sheol, that's the Red Sea, okay, and they're delivered after that to come up to what? Mount Sinai, the mountain of the Lord, okay, so that's the going up to meeting God. So that pattern, okay, exile from the temple to the waters of destruction, the reverse is the redemption. You find this actually in the language of the Israelites very common, even in the Psalms. Psalm 18, look at this, what it says. The sorrows of Sheol surrounded me. In my distress I called upon the Lord. He drew me out of many waters. He delivered me because he delighted in me. Listen to that language, okay? So when we listen to this song, okay, we're starting to understand a little bit of the motifs of creation, okay, of coming out of the water in like the story of Noah, of coming out of the water as in the story of the Israelites and the Red Sea, and now being delivered. So, as we go back into the story of Eden, when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, what did God do at that point? Something specifically happened. He put what on the gate of the Garden of Eden? Who did he assign? Who did he put? Huh? It was a cherubim. So it was a specific angel. It was a cherubim that was put on the gate. After the expulsion, you couldn't go back into the garden. There was a cherubim who's a specific rank of an angel guarding the garden and guarding the tree of life. So not just this. Now you look at the connection again with the tabernacle. The cherubim is actually mentioned very few times in the Old Testament. Actually, the seraphim are mentioned more. But the cherubim is mentioned in the Garden of Eden as protecting access to the gate to the Garden of Eden. You also see it in the tabernacle, that the cherubim is embroidered on the veil that protects the Holy of Holies, but then also on top of the ark, on the lid. As if this kind of, the cherubim's role is to protect, this holy access to God. So in this story, you start to see this parallel between the Garden of Eden, where Yahweh walks to and fro, to them being kicked, to actually Moses re-establishing that connection of dwelling with the people of God, with God, on the holy mountain, on Mount Sinai, on Mount Horeb. To them, basically, it's like, well, we're not going to live the rest of our days on the mount. So the mount has to move with us. How is the mount going to move with us? That's the tabernacle. You see the connection? So the tabernacle instructions were given to Moses on top of Mount Sinai, because at that point, there had to be a practical solution from God where the mountain of the Lord, Eden and Mount Sinai, can move with the people. So that's where the orders to build the tabernacle were given to Moses. So it's kind of the same thing. The tabernacle had a gate, just like the Garden of Eden had a gate that was protected, and just like whoever was with us in the Exodus series, you remember when God told Moses, tell the Israelites, get ready, consecrate yourself for 3 days, but let nobody touch the mountain, because whoever will touch the mountain, whether human or animal, will die. You remember that? That was a gate. You got to be careful as you're approaching this holiness. That same gate was there also when the tabernacle was instructed or instituted. And it became the answer to the question, who shall ascend the hill of the Lord, or who shall stand in his holy place? And the answer was in Psalm 15:2. Whoever walks blamelessly, works righteousness, and speaks truth in his heart, such a one may ascend the mount of Yahweh's abode. It is interesting that this word blamelessly, is the same word used for the chosen lamb of the Passover. It's the same word. So you start to see when you are picking a lamb as a choice lamb to sacrifice to God, it represents your own character, because that's the only way you can approach God. So as we go now from the Garden of Eden, so today we've talked a little bit about the parallel between the Garden of Eden and the tabernacle as a way to bring us back to the dwelling of God of the Garden of Eden, but also as you look at it in the New Testament, which is where we're going to get to in this series, that the tabernacle that the Old Testament had is now what we are living, And that for us is the invitation to dwell and walk with God, in order that when we get to Revelation 21, when John sees the revelation and sees Jerusalem coming down, and the voice tells him, this is where God is going to dwell with his own people. You see the connection? So, as we go into the tabernacle, because we're not going to be able to understand Leviticus until we understand the tabernacle. So the rest of today, we're going to focus a little bit on understanding the tabernacle. What does it mean? God's command to Moses was, let them build me a sanctuary that I may dwell amongst them. Because here also, remember the sequence of events. While they were in Egypt in slavery, they cannot worship God. When you're a slave, you don't own anything to offer, to devote to God. You cannot, because worshiping God is devoting your best, your first. How can you devote something that is your best and your first when you don't own it? If you're a slave, you don't even own anything to offer to God when you're a slave to sin. So God had to redeem them. And we talked about this during Exodus, just to refresh your memory, that the Passover was a 3-component event. It was not just one thing. It was the Passover lamb being sacrificed for them, followed by eating the unleavened bread for 7 days, which is a new creation without sin. And then the 8th day, or the night of the 7th, going into the 8th, you go through death in the Red Sea to rise up on the 8th day as a new creation. You see that sequence? The Passover lamb died for us. And then we were separated from sin by 7 days with a complete new creation to be rising up on the 8th day as a new creation. That's what happens to us in baptism. Because we're baptized, by the grace of the Son through the Holy Spirit. And we rise up from the water as a completely new creation. So that is what happened in Exodus. Now God is telling them, now that you are a new creation, now I'm going to live and dwell amongst you. Now I'm going to show you my glory. Now I'm going to come and be amongst you. That's where the tabernacle comes into place. So now we're going to move a little bit from just the Garden of Eden to actually talk about Mount Sinai and the tabernacle. There are actually several parallels between Mount Sinai to the tabernacle being now the portable Mount Sinai. Think of it this way. Because they wanted to take the glory of God that appeared to them on Mount Sinai all the way as they went into the promised land and after. So first of all, it's divided into 3 levels of holiness. You've got the Holy of Holies, the holy place, and then the outer court. Also, divine speeches. It was actually a place where both Sinai and the tabernacle became a place where God spoke to Moses and to the Israelites. The tablets, because they were given on the summit of Mount Sinai, and they were they were stored inside the tabernacle as God's law. So God spoke and God's law is preserved. But then also there are altars of approach. Just as the mountain had instructions for how people to approach God, the tabernacle had the same thing. So let's move in a little bit into the tabernacle. The Jewish understanding of the tabernacle was very unique because, as I said, they understood the tabernacle as a recreation of Genesis. Just like we talked about. The 7 speeches of God in Genesis 1 was paralleled by the 7 speeches God gave to Moses when he was building the tabernacle in Exodus. You find this, and actually I'm going to go over this quickly and then we'll come back to it. But this is an amazing parallel between the 7 days of creation and the tabernacle, which I find just fascinating. But in the tabernacle, you find hierarchy of metals. Outside in the outer court, because those are 3 levels, the outer court, bronze and copper were used as the main way to build the vessels. As you get into the holy, you start to see some ornamentation of both silver and gold. But when you get into the Holy of Holies, only gold. In fact, God tells him, when you come to the Ark of the Covenant, it has to be gold inside out. You start to see a level of gradation, of consecration. So in this beautiful picture, the outer court open to all Israel. That's where the copper was. And then here, silver and gold in the holy place. This was the priest. The priest would go every day, to offer. And those are the offerings we're going to talk about next time, which are very important. But then the Holy of Holies, which is only one person, the high priest would go in one day of the year to the Holy of Holies. It was pure gold, and that was on Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. Just to refresh your memory, the Day of Atonement, which is Leviticus 16, is considered to be the absolute heart of the whole Pentateuch. Okay? Because Leviticus is the middle book of the two books on the other side, because it's 5 books. Leviticus is the third. And out of the third, the middle chapter is the book of the Atonement, chapter 16. Very important. Even when they were given like the colors, you're given 4 colors, instructions for 4 colors. The white linen indicating the moral, physical purity, restraint on natural lust. That's how the Jewish interpretation looked at it. The scarlet was the life, the force. The scarlet was the blood, always reminding them that our life is represented by blood. It has a price. It has a sanctity. It has a vulnerability. If you lose a lot of blood, you die. And that was always a very important reminder to them in that scarlet color. The purple, which was the color of royalty, telling them that us as human beings, we have the intellect, the reason. It was the bridge between the animalistic nature and God. But then you get into the highest color, which is the blue, which is the divine realm. So even the colors inside the tabernacle were drawing them into a visual array of understanding their own nature and what they're called to as they look into these colors. That's one of the things I love about our Orthodox Church. We play a lot with colors. We play a lot with sense. We play a lot with hearing. You know, anyone who studied iconography, they can give you a whole lecture about why the gold as a background of all the Coptic icons or the Eastern Orthodox icons. So that color reminds us a lot of something. So the same thing within the tabernacle, the white, the scarlet, the purple, and the blue. So now let's kind of go a little bit into kind of the gradation of the tabernacle of entry to God. The outer court, which is kind of called the threshold of transformation. Because in the outer court, you're deciding to come from your ordinary life, your tent, your work, your field, your crops, your animals. You're leaving them on the side, and you're coming in to meet God. Okay? So the outer court was the threshold of transformation, where you are actually approaching God. And in the outer court, there were 2 copper objects, and those we're going to talk about them a lot more next time. There was the copper altar, and this is where all the animal sacrifices were given. Okay, all of them were put on this altar. It was called mizbah or mazbah, just like the Arabic word, ha'olah. And I'm going to actually tell you some beautiful things about this next week. Okay, because this is one of the most beautiful representations of what Leviticus brings us closer to God and brings us closer to Jesus Christ. But that was a wooden ramp that was built on top of it, the copper or bronze altar on which all the sacrifices were given. But then right next to it, there was a copper laver which was filled with water where they had to clean up. It's interesting when you look at the Jewish tradition, okay? This copper laver, which had the water for purification, was made by the copper mirrors given by the women of Egypt to the Israelites when they were leaving Egypt. So the copper mirror, look at the symbolism, okay? Where you look at yourself to self-glorify, like, you know, to look at how beautiful I am, okay? And when you're in slavery, it's used for you to be a slave to your own self. But when you give it to God in transformation, it becomes the laver of washing yourself and getting yourself cleansed from all these attachments in order to meet God, okay? So such an interesting take on it within the Jewish tradition. The laver represents our transformation from the physical into the holiness. It was washing the hands and the feet, signaling total purification in order to be ready for the divine presence. That's the outer court. Now you go into the inner sanctuary. It's called the Kodesh. In Arabic, Quds. Okay, that's the second layer, Kodesh. That one was where the priests, the Levites, can go. Okay, and that one, it was divided into 2 chambers by a veil. The veil separated the Kodesh from the Kodesh of Kodashim, which is the Holy of the Holies. You understand? So you've got the holy area, and then there is a veil that then separates the most inner part, which is the Holy of Holies. That is the veil at the time of Golgotha, when Christ died, that was ripped from top to bottom. Where because of the cross and through the cross, we all now have access to what the holy priest had access to only one day out of the year as the high priest only. Just imagine this. You had a congregation of millions, and only one of them who could represent them in coming to God and going through that veil once a year. And we get to it by Christ. As much as I feel the privilege I'm living, I sometimes go back to the Old Testament to understand the value of what I'm living. A lot of people say, why do you study the Old Testament? Khalas, we're living in the New Testament. We're living in a new era. But you realize actually the Old Testament gives you the sense of value of what we are currently living. So what was in that inner sanctuary, the Kodesh? There were 3 primary vessels in this sanctuary, and each one of them had a meaning. So I'm going to start by actually what's called the bread of faces, of the bread of the loaves, lechem hapanim, which was, it's called the showbread, or the table of the faces. What was this? So every week, the priests would bake 12 loaves of bread. Okay, so they would take it from what the wheat and the flour from the people. Okay, brings any memories of what we do in the Urban? So they bring it and they put the 12 loaves inside the Kodesh. And at the end of the 12 weeks, at the end of the week, the priests eat that. The priests eat that. The 12 loaves represent the livelihood of the 12 tribes of Israel. But here's the interesting thing. The menorah, or the lampstand, was basically God's light shining. It was supposed that the 7 lamps to beam forward, illuminating on the 12 loaves of the showbread. Basically, that God is shining his light all the time on the livelihood of his people. So the purpose of the menorah, which brings back in the Garden of Eden the creation of the lights, that God is shining always on his people. And the duty of the priests was always to keep the menorah, the 7 lamps, always lit, and those 12 showbread always fresh from week to week, to be eaten at the end. That's God's life-giving presence, always in that time. The third object in there was the incense altar. So it's very interesting. And there's been a lot of debate, a lot of people kind of trying to find, okay, so the animals were outside. The animals were never entered into the Kodesh or the Holy of the Holies. Okay? They were always outside. Inside the Kodesh or the Holy, it was only the incense, the altar of incense. And the purpose of the altar of incense, definitely it gives the sweet aroma, but also it brought memory always to the priest as he's approaching God's presence. When God appeared to Moses on Mount Sinai, or when he appeared to the Israelites, how did he show himself? In 2 objects. What were they? The cloud and the fire. Right? The cloud and the fire. So in the incense, you're bringing back the memory of God's showing his glory to his people through the cloud and the fire. And that's one of the reasons why that incense always had to be on. It was 24/7. So it's interesting that the Holy of Holies was utilized once a year. The outside court, okay, the sacrifices, and we'll come to it next time, there were sacrifices presented on certain occasions, there were sacrifices that were presented around the clock. But inside the holy, those three objects were 24/7. What does this indicate? Our livelihood is inside the holy. Our livelihood is not outside. Our livelihood is inside God. Like when God wants to represent our livelihood, it's like inside his bosom. When a father wants to make a son feel, truly you are my son or you're my daughter, what do? They bring them close into their bosom. So God is saying, your livelihood is inside my bosom, is inside the holy. And my lamp, my light is always shining on you. And my presence will never depart from you. That's where the incense altar is there. So now let's go a little bit more inside. The Holy of Holies, the core of the covenant. It's a perfect cube. It was entered only once a year by the high priest, as we talked about. It was gold inside out, as the Talmudic says that actually it was representation that one's inner world must be as pure as one's outer world. The ark is like the epitome of perfection. It is very interesting how their contemplation, and this is, I'm biased because I love when I study this, even though I always love to study the symbolism in the New Testament and how the church fathers took it, but I'd like to see how the original people interpreted it first before going into the church fathers. So it was given in 2.5 cubits cube, okay, not a full measurement. And their interpretation, based on the Jewish tradition, why is it not like 3 cubits or 2 cubits, was almost like a reminder that no matter what we give to God, there's always something broken about it. It's like, it's never a full measure. It's never a full perfection. It's never a full cubit, okay? It's always 2.5 or something that is less than a perfect measurement. It's interesting. If you guys know, actually, so the Ark of the Covenant, because it was a portable sanctuary, there were poles running inside the box to be carried by the priests as they moved from one place to the other. Those poles were never removed. So it's kind of an interesting thing, because you would think like, okay, so we came and settled. Okay, we put the ark in the middle, now we established the Holy of Holies and the Holy and this. Okay, remove the poles. You don't need them anymore. But God always told them the poles always have to be there. The reason why, because basically he was always giving the message, is that you cannot limit me to one spot and say, this is where God is. God can move everywhere. In a very interesting turn of things, this became what Ezekiel saw in his vision. Do you remember in Ezekiel's vision when he saw the glory of the Lord on a chariot with wheels on all 4 corners? Okay? And people kind of like interpret it in different ways, but part of it was basically that God was telling that my glory is all over the world, can move anywhere. Okay? It's not limited to one space. So that's one of the reasons why this pole was never removed. It can always move with the Israelites. On top of the ark, there was a lid, and this lid had the 2 cherubim. So the cherubim, as I said, were mentioned in this in 2 places. In the Garden of Eden, as a protection to the tree of life, and then in the tabernacle. And in the tabernacle, they were placed on 2 spots. On the veil that separated the holy from the Holy of Holies, and then on top of the Ark of the Covenant. And this structure, which was the lid and the cherubim overlaying it, was called the mercy seat. It was called the mercy seat. And this is specifically where it says, there I will meet with you, and I will speak with you from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubim. This became where God would speak to the high priest. This is the space of relationship. This is the space of interaction with humanity. So what's inside the Ark of the Covenant? Well, several things. Number one, the stone tablets, which God gave. And then interesting, I didn't really know this until I was doing my research. The broken tablets, they kept them even there, indicating human failure and God's forgiveness. So the original one that God gave that Moses broke, and then the new ones were kept in there. The jar of manna, representing God's faithfulness in providing for them, and then Aaron's rod, which was basically God's acknowledgement of the Aaronic priesthood as a way to approach God. Okay? Because he's basically trying to tell them, you know, you guys are free now, but you have to understand, I, as a holy God, you can't just approach me without understanding my holiness. Okay? And the Aaronic priesthood was the method or the way for them to approach him. And that's one of the reasons why the high priest became humanity's representative, corresponding to the sixth day of creation in Adam. We talked about that. So Aaron's role was to arrange the lamps, to put the showbread. The Levites were doing all the offering of the sacrifices. But then it's very interesting that how the Aaronic blessing, the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. So you know how Abuna at the very end always gives us the blessing that we go out with? This was the blessing. May the Lord make his face shine upon you. Just like the menorah was shining upon the 12 loaves. That's why they were called the 12 loaves of the faces. This was called the showbread of the faces. Just like that, when the priest comes out to the people, he would bless them. It's called the priestly blessing. May the Lord shine his face upon you. Just like as inside is happening outside. So as you look at this, you know, the days of creation and the tabernacle, you know, the heavens and the earth, you have two tablets in the ark. The firmament, you remember the firmament was kind of separating. The veil was separating between the Holy of Holies and the Holy. The gathering of the waters was represented in the copper laver as the water was there. The luminaries, the smaller and the big and the greater light, were in the seven-branched menorah. The winged creatures on the fifth day, the cherubim on the mercy seat. The creation of Adam is the high priest. But then also, you remember when we talked about in Exodus, the peak or the pinnacle of the creation was not Adam. It was the Sabbath rest. Because that's the day, that's the only thing in the 7 days of creation that God sanctified. He sanctified the Sabbath. Because that was the day that he intended to create for us to dwell with him. What is parallel to it is that after Moses built this, after it was built by the artisans, moved by the Holy Spirit, by the same Spirit that was there in Genesis 1 when it said, and the Spirit of the Lord was hovering over the water. It's the same word that was talked about or referenced to Bezalel when he built the tabernacle. It says in Exodus 40, the cloud covered the tent of the meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. This became a moment in the life of Israel that was so important that all the prophets keep referring to it. Then the Lord will create above every dwelling place of Mount of Zion a cloud and a smoke by day, and the shining of the flaming fire by night. So in their darkest moments, when they lost the temple, when they went into exile, they always had that vision of when God, after the completion of the tabernacle, his glory came upon it. I will be a wall of fire around her, and I'll be the glory in her midst. It's interesting when you look at the Jewish word for glory, okay? It's a very interesting word. It's a Jewish word, it's a Hebrew word called kavod. Kavod means heavy, means heavy. In fact, it's very interesting, anyone who knows Arabic, kavod is a cognate of the Arabic word kibd, which is the liver. What is the heaviest organ in the body? It's the liver. So the cognate of kavod means heavy. God's glory is something to celebrate, but it's a heavy responsibility to deal with it. It's a heavy responsibility to know how to approach it. And when God approached this, it's interesting, the tabernacle, when His glory became there, it didn't just become a dwelling place for God. It was named after that from a dwelling place, a tabernacle, to a tent of meeting. The ordained way was that basically it is the place where God's presence is, where the people can come and meet with Him. This is an interesting distinction, because God's reason for dwelling in a place is not just to name and claim it. God's reason for dwelling in a place is to invite people to meet Him there. So while they were building the tabernacle to be a place for God's presence, at the end, when God's presence came upon it, it became a tent of meeting. But so interesting, this is something that I love about the Pentateuch, and this is where we're going to end today. Just like we ended Genesis, we went from the glory of Adam. The last word in Genesis was mentioning Joseph being buried in the land of Egypt, in a foreign land, in a land that is going to become the foreign enslavement. You go from glory to like a puzzle at the end. How do you end there? And then Exodus becomes the answer of bringing out the Israelites, but also the bones of Joseph. We talked about this in Exodus, how the bones of Joseph were taken out with them, and they brought it back to the promised land. Exodus ends on the same puzzle, because Exodus is all about Moses meeting God up on the mountain. Yet Exodus ends with this very puzzling verse. After God's glory came on the tabernacle, Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud rested above it and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Commentators puzzled on this quite a bit, and this is where the book of Leviticus gets very exciting. Because how come after building the tabernacle and after God gave Moses the chance to meet Him face to face up on the mountain, it would make most sense that now God is in the tent, now it's the tent of meeting, Moses can enter. But yet Moses could not make it in. And that's a puzzle that we're going to have to solve. Why is this puzzle there? Because you have to realize Moses is now entering the tabernacle or the tent of meeting, not representing himself anymore, but representing who? The whole people. If you're going to present the whole people, it has to go through the right mediation. What is the right mediation? It's the mediation of the priesthood. That's how we look at our Lord Jesus Christ. When our Lord Jesus Christ became our mediator, yes, He fulfilled the prophetic word of Moses. He was the prophet. But also He was our high priest. That's one of the reasons why any of the deacons would know during all Lent, what is the hymn that we sing always? Mirelu, right? Our high priest, undefiled. Because we're acknowledging that in His ability as the high priest who fulfilled all the Levitical aspects is what allows us to enter into God's presence. Moses by himself, because he was not the high priest, could not bring in the people into God's presence. even though he was the Savior. So that's one of the reasons why when you look at actually our Lord Jesus Christ and his representation in the Old Testament, not one character suffices. Not one event suffices. Not only Exodus and the Passover can suffice to explain it. You almost have to come all the way to understand Exodus as well as Leviticus, to understand how big, or like how wide, how deep is our Lord's sacrifice for us. So I'm going to leave it at this, and then next time we're going to go a little bit into Leviticus. But just with this puzzle, that as Genesis ended in a puzzle, Exodus ends in a puzzle. That the most celebrated person in the book of Exodus was Moses, who was given the instructions to build the tabernacle, and when God's glory entered the tabernacle, he couldn't go in. And it says in here, interesting, that you know why? Because the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. That's why. What's the solution? The Levitical priesthood. And that's what we're going to talk about next time. So to summarize today, when I was talking about Leviticus, if you take Leviticus just as is, it is a very tough chapter to read. It's a very tough book to read. It's a very tough book to understand and to make sense of it. But when you put it in the sense of the big story of answering the question, who and how can a person dwell with God? And you bring it all the way from Eden, which was the original model of God dwelling with us amongst Adam and Eve, and you take the lessons of it and you bring it all the way to the New Jerusalem, when the voice says, this is the place of dwelling of God with his people. And in this journey, you see it all fulfilled in every part that we discussed in the person of our Lord Jesus Christ. Because in him we see, and we're going to study more, how the outer transformation and the outer sanctuary happening through the sacrifices, going into the inner sanctuary happening through the showbread, the menorah, and the altar of incense, okay, and his presence. And all the way into the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant, gold inside out, holding the most important things of God's representation within us, which is the tablets of law, his commandments to us, the manna, his provision for us. His law never comes, in without provision, okay? But then also the priesthood of Aaron, which is a representation of this is how you approach me. And interesting how Christ fulfills all that. So it becomes an amazing book to read. And as we're going to go a little bit more into the details of each and sacrifice, you're going to start to like, oh wow, this actually is really cool. So next time we're going to talk a little bit about what is the overall system of the sacrifices. And after that, going to go into each sacrifice into details. I don't know if I'm going to do it this time, or actually I'm going to be traveling for a couple of months, and then I'll come back. But there is actually a beautiful, beautiful parallel to be made between what we're studying here and the transfiguration of Christ. It is beyond amazing. The symbolism, the imagery, the words, and you look at it in the New Testament in the Transfiguration, it's all in this part, in Exodus and Leviticus. And it becomes so exciting as, like, after we finish Leviticus, to now do almost like a one-time session. Okay, let's come to the New Testament and look at the Transfiguration, read the text of the Transfiguration, and everything is going to light up at that point. All right? Thank you guys for coming and encouraging me. It was a very, very busy day. Everyone was running, but I know there was a lot of prayers going on. Any questions or comments? Yes. Okay. So the question for those online, what is the significance of ascending the hill? So the imagery of the meeting place of God always on a mountain was the primal representation of the place that God chose for the meeting place. In contrast to what? If you remember the story of the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Babel, where they fell in is they were building a tower, a mountain, okay, in order to bring God down. And that's why it failed. You don't build the meeting place and put your demands on God at that point. If you remember, it's like, you know what, we want to build it to make a name for ourselves. Not a name for God, a name for ourselves. On the contrast, and I'll let you kind of answer. Eden, in the cosmology of Eden, it was thought to be a mount. The garden was on a mountain. As I said, like Noah, when he was saved, was put on Mountain Ararat. Abraham, when it was asked to give sacrifice of Isaac, he was asked to go to Mount Moriah. Okay? Moses, when he had the burning bush, was on Mount Horeb, which is thought to be also as Mount Sinai. When he brought them out of Egypt, they went up to God on Mount Sinai. Jerusalem, okay, is thought to be the place actually where Abraham presented. So Mount Moriah is thought to be the same as Mount Zion. So there was a symbolism that whenever you are meeting God, you are ascending. That's one of the reasons why there are some of these psalms that called them Psalms of Ascent. Okay? That you're meeting God at his meeting place. The mountain is thought to be the place where earth meets heaven, or heaven meets earth. So yes. So it was not just unique about the Jewish tradition. So even within the Canaanite tradition, the Greek tradition, like the pagans had that same idea, because also for them, like, you know, it's the point where heaven meets earth. Okay, part of it, I think it is, you know, almost like the Edenic residue was in everyone, that this is where you meet God. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why, for example, in the Old Testament, one of the ways that the prophets used to be angry about the people, that they would go and worship in the high places. Okay, what are the high places? Those were sanctuaries on mountains or hills devoted for Baal and for other gods. So yes, to your point. So the ziggurats are actually more like the Tower of Babel. Ziggurats are like, Tower of Babel is thought to be a ziggurat-like structure. Okay? Exactly. Yes. Yes, 100%. Probably gonna give you like this, because like.
Am I like super quiet? Oh, okay. How am I supposed to say it? So when you meet God and when you ascend, do you meet God like only like, and just saying from the Older Testament, like on a mountain? Is that basically what he's saying?
So yes and no. The fact is that God is everywhere.
Yeah.
However, for the ceremonial purposes of where God would meet them, for example, as they built the temple, okay, they built it on top of the mountain. It is a symbolic representation. It doesn't certainly mean exclusively that God is only present in that area. But it had a symbol of basically, as you're ascending the mountain, by nature, you're looking upwards, okay? So there was, like you gotta realize something. We are very, very embodied creatures. Mm-hmm. As our bodies, they always say, like, for example, it was very interesting. There is some research that talks about how your mood and your memory is so different if you are reading like this versus reading like this. Okay, just looking up. Okay, and I found this just fascinating. So I think we're very embodied as human beings. So the fact that as you are going to the place of pilgrimage every year, which is the temple, being on a mountain brings you up, you know, a little bit into ascent even in your own spirit.
I guess from a perspective, I suppose, is from a very spiritual New Age perspective. Like they say, like when you go onto a mountain, like in places like Utah, that where they have like a lot of mountain and a lot of frequencies like up there, it's more so they have a lot of spiritual realms.
So
in a sense, do you think that it's like more of like, that's why a lot of pagan traditions like the Greeks and the Canaanites would do that, because there is such thing as that?
So that is an interesting question from a religion anthropology perspective. I have no doubt in my mind that if we are all, you know, creatures of the same creation,
Yeah.
okay, there is a primordial sense in us that brings us a bit of a reminiscence of Eden, okay, and what it was. And we as human beings from different traditions, different paths, have that same feeling. Whether or not that there is more spiritual presence in high places or not, I can't speak for that. But I know, at least from a lot of research, that how the universal sense of religion, the universal sense of spirituality, exists among many different traditions. And I don't think this means a plurality of truth as much as a unified origin of all where we all started. That's one of the reasons why, for example, you know, you find there's a lot of commonality amongst religions in terms of some of the ideas. Well, because our origin is the same. If we all come from Adam and Eve, okay, that original sense of religiosity, of looking for God in these places, existed. I think there's another factor, and there's an immense amount of research on this, on the aspect of awe as a very primordial religious experience. So people feel drawn to the spiritual, to the transcendent, when they're in a very magnificent place, like the Grand Canyon or in front of an ocean. That sense of awe is so primordial, and in all of us, that brings us out of ourselves, that's part of our creation. So I don't know about that there are certain spiritual powers, you know.
I say spiritual powers, but it's more of like a realm. Like
A realm, yes.
More of like you kind of get connected almost to like the spiritual side.
Could be. Like to be honest with you, do we believe that there's spiritual realms in the whole world? Absolutely. I'll never deny that. How much of that is tied in with the high places? I don't know.
Yeah.
But at least if we talk about human nature, I think there's a lot of that to be in common. So, great question. Yes. Can I just pass you the microphone?
Or wait, who's speaking? Oh, okay. Oh, hi.
Great questions, by the way.
I think if we simplify it a bit, the mountain would be a place that is away from the city and away from other people. So that's a place that we go to with intention. The only thing that you would go to the top of the mountain for would be whatever you're ascending it for. So you're not going to the top of the mountain to buy cattle or to do this or that or whatever. So I think if we apply this to our own lives, the mountain for us can be just a quiet place with intention. So if you're going into your bedroom and you're closing your door and you're setting your intention to meet God, I think that's just as powerful as going to the top of a mountain. So if you're away from the city, away from the noise, and setting your eyes on Christ, that's where you can ascend. And then something that was really cool that I saw a couple weeks ago about the mountain was that they actually think that, I think you alluded to this, that they have speculated that it might be the same mountain that Abraham ascended with his son as the same mountain that Jesus died on, which is so significant. You kind of stated that a little bit, but that's so cool for everyone else that's here. The son had to carry his own wood that he was about to be sacrificed on. So Abraham asked his son Isaac to carry that himself. So that's such a beautiful prophecy of Jesus to come. So he had to carry that wood, and he had to make that sacrifice on himself as an innocent person, climbing to the top. And then when they got to the top, there was an animal that was able to be sacrificed. But it's so beautiful that Jesus did that as well. So if we think about that in our own lives, what can we do to lay down things or to take up our cross and to ascend that mountain, to gladly accept the things that God has laid on us? I think oftentimes we are thinking, oh, why me? Why is God making me, if God's so good, why is he doing this? Why am I suffering? But both Jesus and Isaac gladly took that upon their backs, even though they were innocent, and they were appreciative, and they did exactly what their father told them to do, and they were obedient. And then what happened at the end is that God met them right there. So I think for us, for practical application, taking sacrifice willingly, having intention to meet God, and meeting him in a quiet place.
So I love that sharing. There is a lot of debate about actually, the place where Jesus died. So I would not discount the parallel, but from an academic perspective, Mount Moriah is thought to be the mount of the temple, and Christ was, crucified outside of the city. Golgotha was outside of the city. Still on a mount. In fact, actually, there is a very, very strong tradition, which, here's the thing, tradition never needs to be proven, because tradition carries within it the beauty of symbolism, even though you can never prove it. But actually, that is the mount where Adam is buried. Okay? Adam, actually in some of the Eastern Orthodox iconography, okay, where the cross is actually on top of Adam's tomb. So to say that there's a lot of different traditions, it's hard to be 100% dogmatic about one or the other, but I think the symbolism, as you mentioned, is so beautiful. I love your contemplation about the mountain and what it represents to us, because basically, you can see the symbolism from the church, from the biblical perspective. It was very strong, very strong. So thank you for sharing. All right, any final comments or questions? All right, thank you all. Have a wonderful night, and I'll see you next Tuesday at 7:30. Thank you.